Have you ever met someone who absolutely refuses to apologize, no matter the situation? They might deflect, make excuses, or even act like nothing happened at all. It's easy to label that behavior as arrogance or stubbornness, but often something deeper is going on beneath the surface. Carl Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in modern psychology, explored how the structure of the human personality shapes the way we respond to conflict, mistakes, and self-awareness. According to Jung, much of our behavior isn't random. It's driven by internal dynamics between the conscious self and the parts of our personality we prefer not to acknowledge. When these internal tensions go unresolved, they can show up as defensiveness, denial, or even an inability to say something as simple as, "I'm sorry." This isn't about good people versus bad people. It's about understanding the psychological patterns that make admitting fault feel impossible for some individuals. Apologizing might seem like a small act, but for certain personality types, it challenges the very foundation of how they see themselves. So, inspired by Jung's ideas about the ego, self-awareness, and personal growth, let's explore 7 common traits that tend to appear in people who struggle to apologize, and what these traits reveal about the way the human mind protects itself. 1. Over-identification with the ego. For some people, admitting fault feels like tearing down their entire identity. In Jung's view, the ego is the part of the psyche that organizes our sense of I, the version of ourselves we consciously identify with. It's what helps us navigate the world, make decisions, and maintain a consistent self-image. But when someone becomes overly identified with their ego, that self-image becomes rigid and fragile. They start to believe that being wrong equals being weak, flawed, or unworthy. An apology, then, isn't seen as an act of honesty. It's seen as a collapse of self. Because the ego thrives on being right and maintaining control, any admission of fault feels like a personal defeat rather than a natural part of human interaction. Jung observed that the ego, when overinflated, tries to dominate the personality and push away anything that threatens its authority. This creates a kind of inner tension, a battle between the ego's desire to appear flawless and the reality of being human and imperfect. Instead of acknowledging mistakes, these individuals protect their self-image at all costs. They rationalize, minimize, or redirect blame, all to avoid facing the discomfort of being wrong. Ironically, this defense only makes the ego weaker. The more tightly a person clings to their image of perfection, the more fragile that image becomes. Apologizing feels impossible because it would mean confronting the truth that the ego has worked so hard to deny, that they are not always right. And that's okay. This over-identification with the ego is often the foundation for all the other traits that follow. When a person can't separate their sense of self from their sense of being right, every apology feels like a threat. And that's where the real struggle begins. But it's not just the ego that makes it hard to apologize. For many, the problem runs deeper. They simply don't take the time to look inward. 2. Lack of self-reflection. Many people who struggle to apologize also struggle with self-reflection. They move through life reacting to situations without stopping to examine their own behavior or motivations. When something goes wrong, their instinct is to look outward, to circumstances, to other people, but rarely inward. Jung emphasized that self-awareness is a cornerstone of psychological growth. He believed that much of what drives human behavior lies below the surface, in the unconscious. Without reflection, people remain unaware of these hidden forces shaping their actions. They repeat the same patterns, unaware of why they do what they do or how their choices impact others. A lack of self-reflection often comes from discomfort. Looking at oneself honestly can be unsettling. It forces a person to face imperfections, inconsistencies, and unresolved emotions. For some, that kind of honesty feels threatening, so they avoid it entirely. Instead, they stay busy, distracted, or defensive, convincing themselves that they have nothing to apologize for because they didn't do anything wrong. This avoidance can also create blind spots. When someone can't or won't examine their role in a conflict, they fail to recognize the moments when an apology could repair trust or understanding. They may even perceive others' hurt as exaggerated or unjustified because they haven't paused to consider how their actions might have contributed to it. Jung would say that without reflection, the unconscious takes the lead. In other words, when people don't consciously explore their own motives, those unexamined drives end up controlling their behavior from the background. The result is a kind of inner stagnation, a person who reacts but never learns, defends but never understands. Without the ability to reflect, growth stops. And when growth stops, so does accountability. Saying sorry requires awareness of one's impact, but for those who resist self-examination, that awareness never develops in the first place. And when self-reflection is missing, another pattern often takes its place: the tendency to project one's own flaws onto others. 3. Projection of fault. When someone lacks self-reflection, the next defense often comes naturally: projection. Instead of acknowledging their own mistakes, they shift the blame elsewhere. In Jungian psychology, projection is one of the most common ways the mind defends itself from discomfort. It happens when a person unconsciously attributes their own undesirable traits, motives, or emotions to someone else, essentially seeing in others what they refuse to see in themselves. For example, a person who feels guilt but can't face it may accuse others of being unfair or overly sensitive. Someone who fears being wrong might insist that everyone else is the problem. By externalizing what they can't accept internally, they maintain the illusion of being in control, blameless, or even morally superior. Jung described projection as a kind of psychological mirror. What we reject in ourselves, we often end up noticing or criticizing most in others. But for people who struggle to apologize, this mirror becomes a shield. It keeps them from seeing their own role in conflicts and prevents any meaningful self-correction. The act of projecting fault also provides emotional relief. It lets the ego off the hook. If the blame belongs to someone else, then there's no need to feel guilty, no need to make amends, and certainly no need to say, "I'm sorry." But this relief is temporary. It comes at the cost of genuine understanding. Over time, projection distorts reality, creating patterns of conflict and misunderstanding that the person cannot see are of their own making. When projection becomes habitual, relationships and communication start to break down. Others may feel constantly misunderstood or unfairly accused, while the person doing the projecting feels perpetually wronged. It becomes a closed loop of defensiveness and denial. Jung believed that confronting projection is a key step in personal development. It means recognizing that what irritates or angers us in others may actually be a reflection of something unresolved within ourselves. But for someone who can't apologize, that kind of self-honesty feels too threatening. Accepting responsibility would mean dismantling the illusion of control that projection provides. And once a person begins to rely on projection to protect their ego, another trait tends to follow: an inflated sense of superiority that keeps them feeling powerful even when they're deeply insecure. 4. Inflated sense of superiority. An inflated sense of superiority often grows out of the same psychological soil as projection. Once someone has pushed their flaws onto others, it becomes easier to believe that they are somehow above those same shortcomings. In Jungian terms, this is the ego attempting to preserve dominance by exaggerating its own importance. It's a form of overcompensation, masking insecurity with pride. People with this mindset see themselves as the most rational, competent, or morally correct person in the room. They interpret disagreement as disrespect and view criticism as a personal attack. For them, apologizing feels not only unnecessary, but degrading. To say, "I was wrong," would be to step down from the pedestal they've built for themselves, and their ego can't tolerate that fall. Jung noted that when the ego inflates beyond balance, it begins to lose touch with reality. The person becomes trapped in a one-sided view of themselves, disconnected from the broader complexity of human nature. This inflated ego resists humility, because humility would expose the illusion of superiority it depends on. This attitude also creates a feedback loop. The less someone apologizes, the more they reinforce their self-image as someone who never needs to. Each refusal becomes proof, at least in their own mind, that they were right all along. Over time, this pattern isolates them from honest feedback. Others may stop challenging them, not because they agree, but because it's easier than facing the inevitable defensiveness or dismissal. Underneath the surface, though, this superiority often hides deep insecurity. The stronger the need to appear perfect, the more fragile the self-esteem becomes. Jung believed that such one-sidedness, clinging too tightly to a single self-image, creates imbalance in the psyche. The parts of the personality that are ignored or suppressed don't disappear. They simply move into the unconscious and wait to be acknowledged. For someone who can't apologize, superiority becomes armor. It shields them from shame and protects the illusion of control, but it also prevents genuine connection. Others might see confidence, but what's really at play is fear. The fear of being seen as imperfect, ordinary, or human. And that fear leads directly into the next trait, one that hides beneath the surface of their pride. A deep resistance to vulnerability. 5. Of vulnerability. Beneath the facade of confidence and control lies one of the most powerful forces behind the inability to apologize: fear of vulnerability. For many people, saying, "I'm sorry," is not just an admission of wrongdoing. It's an act of exposure. It requires revealing something most egos try hard to conceal: imperfection, doubt, and emotional openness. Carl Jung emphasized that growth depends on confronting the parts of ourselves we prefer to hide. Vulnerability is one of those parts. To be vulnerable means to lower the defenses that protect the ego and allow others to see our humanity. Yet for someone who fears being perceived as weak, this kind of openness feels unsafe. Admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it's terrifying. This fear often develops as a defense mechanism. Somewhere along the way, the person learned, consciously or not, that showing emotion or admitting mistakes leads to loss of control, embarrassment, or rejection. As a result, they equate strength with emotional restraint and weakness with self-disclosure. Their entire sense of security depends on appearing untouchable. When faced with situations that require an apology, this fear activates immediately. Rather than acknowledging harm or error, they retreat into denial, justification, or emotional withdrawal. To them, saying sorry feels like handing over power. They might even convince themselves that apologizing gives others an advantage or diminishes their worth. Jung would interpret this as the ego's attempt to avoid integration, the process of embracing the full range of one's emotions and experiences. The individual avoids vulnerability because it threatens the ego's carefully constructed identity. but the cost of that avoidance is high. Without vulnerability, there can be no authenticity. In practice, this fear leads to emotional rigidity. These individuals may seem calm or composed on the outside, but that composure is often just suppression. They struggle to express empathy, not because they don't care, but because caring openly would mean letting their guard down. And when the walls stay up, true connection becomes impossible. The irony, as Jung might point out, is that strength and vulnerability are not opposites. They're intertwined. The willingness to admit fault, to be seen as imperfect, is what allows the psyche to grow and mature. Without it, a person remains trapped behind the very armor that was meant to protect them. And when vulnerability is suppressed for too long, it doesn't just affect how a person apologizes. It begins to shape how they relate to emotion itself. That's when another trait starts to emerge: emotional detachment. 6. Emotional detachment. Emotional detachment is one of the most defining barriers for people who struggle to say sorry. It's not that they are incapable of emotion, but rather that they've learned to disconnect from it as a form of protection. In Jungian psychology, this is often seen as the psyche's attempt to maintain control by distancing itself from feelings that seem overwhelming, unpredictable, or inconvenient to the ego's image. For someone who fears vulnerability, emotional detachment feels safe. It allows them to navigate life with a sense of control, free from the discomfort of guilt, empathy, or regret. But that emotional distance comes at a cost. It dulls the ability to truly connect with others or to recognize the emotional impact of one's actions. When a person is detached, they approach conflict from a purely rational or defensive standpoint. They analyze situations like problems to be solved, not experiences to be understood. If someone expresses hurt, the detached person may respond with logic rather than empathy. "That's not what I meant." Or, "You're overreacting." To them, feelings seem irrational, messy, or even threatening, so they dismiss them instead of engaging. Jung believed that emotion is an essential bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, a vital part of what makes a person whole. When emotions are ignored or repressed, they don't disappear. They sink below awareness and influence behavior from the shadows. Emotional detachment, then, is not genuine calmness. It's avoidance. It prevents a person from processing guilt or remorse, which are precisely the emotions that motivate an apology. This detachment can also reinforce other defensive patterns. Without emotional awareness, it becomes easy to rationalize hurtful actions or minimize their consequences. A detached person might convince themselves that others are simply too sensitive, or that apologizing wouldn't change anything. This keeps the ego comfortable but stifles emotional growth. Over time, the absence of emotional connection can lead to a flatness in interactions. Relationships become transactional rather than empathetic. The person may appear composed or even admirable in their self-control, but inside, there's a lack of warmth and depth. Jung described this as an imbalance, when one function of the psyche dominates while others are neglected. In this case, reason overshadows feeling, creating a one-sided personality. For someone who can't say sorry, emotional detachment is both a symptom and a defense. It shields them from the discomfort of remorse, but also from the satisfaction of genuine reconciliation. The inability to access emotion keeps them from fully engaging with themselves and others. And when emotion is suppressed long enough, something else takes root, a quiet but persistent resistance to change. The person becomes stuck, unable to move forward or evolve, which leads directly to the final trait: resistance to personal growth. 7. Resistance to personal growth. Resistance to personal growth is the final and perhaps most deeply rooted trait in people who can't bring themselves to apologize. It's not just about avoiding change, it's about protecting a carefully maintained self-image that cannot tolerate being questioned. To apologize would mean admitting that growth is necessary, that something within them needs to evolve. For many, that realization feels threatening, not liberating. Carl Jung believed that growth, or what he called individuation, is the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. It's how a person becomes whole by recognizing and accepting their own contradictions, flaws, and potential. But individuation demands honesty. It requires confronting what we deny, resist, or repress. For someone who fears this kind of self-confrontation, resistance to growth becomes a lifelong pattern. People who resist growth often cling to certainty. They rely on fixed beliefs about who they are. I'm just like this, or that's how I've always been. These statements act as shields, keeping them safe from introspection. The idea of change implies that the current version of themselves might be incomplete or mistaken, and that thought alone is intolerable. Instead of evolving, they rationalize. They defend their behavior, blame external factors, or find fault in others, all to maintain the illusion of consistency. Jung would say this is the ego's final line of defense. By refusing to change, the ego protects its boundaries, but it also traps the individual in stagnation. Without self-examination, the same emotional patterns repeat over and over. The person may notice that conflicts follow them from one situation to another, yet they never see their own role in creating them. Every disagreement, every strained relationship becomes another confirmation that others are the problem. Apologizing represents a small but profound act of self-growth. It's the recognition that one's behavior can evolve, that awareness can replace defensiveness, and that imperfection is not failure, but humanity. For those who resist growth, this step feels impossible because it dismantles the very identity they've spent years defending. Over time, this resistance isolates them, not just from others, but from their own potential. Jung suggested that when we resist change, the psyche responds with inner tension. The parts of ourselves that seek expression, the humble, self-aware, and emotionally intelligent parts, remain buried, creating frustration and dissatisfaction that can surface in subtle ways: irritability, cynicism, or chronic defensiveness. People who can't say sorry are often not lacking morality or intelligence. They're lacking integration. Their ego has built walls where bridges should be. Growth requires the courage to admit, "I was wrong," and to see that phrase not as defeat, but as a doorway to becoming more complete. And in the end, Jung's message still holds true. What we refuse to face in ourselves continues to shape us from the shadows. The inability to apologize isn't a permanent flaw. It's a sign that the journey of self-understanding has paused. Resuming that journey begins with one simple but powerful act of humility: the willingness to look inward and take responsibility.